Okay. Yep.
Okie doke. All right. We will give it a couple of minutes. Um, we're actually over the 500 that I thought we would have. We had 512 registrations for today's session, and we'll give it a moment or two while people come in, join us, grab their last minute cup of coffee. Good morning if you're over in the West. Good morning if you're in the middle of the country. And good afternoon, and you're heading closer to the weekend if you're over on the Eastern Seaboard. And for anybody else, we've got a few from overseas joining us. Welcome wherever and whatever time zone it is that you are in. Now we do have, oh, that's very nice. Hi, Edgar, lovely to hear from you down in Tasmania, where it's also 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and hopefully you're having a very nice lunch. Thank you for the test. We appreciate that. I'm Ainsley. Nice for you to pop your hand up. We're going to ask you to pop your questions into. So we've got hands going up all over the place. Lovely to see you all here. You may ask, there will be a record. Let's start. I'm Claire, and it is great to have you here joining us to try and make sense of what happened this week with the ESOS Act changes, and most crucially, what they're going to mean for the sector. I am delighted to be joined by two experts to try and dissect this with me. Dirk Mulder, known to all of you as the editor of Koala News, and the fabulous Tracy Harris, a contributor to Koala News, and so much more. And I'm going to ask both of them to introduce themselves in a moment. But before we start, let's do a little bit about how this will work. There will be a recording of this. She checks that it is still recording. This is very good. There will be a recording of this webinar, and we will be putting it on my website. That's clarefield.com.au/news. And Dirk will share the link, I think, through Koala News, and also run the audio through the podcast, What Now, What Next. So if your friends or colleagues want to listen to us while they're mowing the lawns, we'll make sure that they can do that as well. We will be taking your questions throughout today's webinar. We will try our best to try and keep an eye on them as we're dissecting what's been happening, and to leave time at the end to do a bit of a wrap up. And let me now start by saying that I am privileged to be joining you today from the unceded lands of the Gadigal people here in Sydney, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present, and to the Indigenous elders of the countries and lands that you are joining us all from today. I'm Claire Field. Many of you will know me as a woman probably with far too many opinions. I've asked each of us to just give a little précis of what we bring to this conversation to help make sense of it. Podcast listeners will know that's how I start my podcasts. I've got a varied career in the sector, but what I particularly bring to trying to make sense of this is my work in government shaping policy based on data, research and evidence, a data nerd, and tragically also as a former regulator. So public, private, but mostly what I'm bringing today to the conversation is that lens to try and understand what's been happening. Tracy Harris, welcome. Fill us in.
Thanks, Claire. I'd also like to extend my acknowledgement of country to the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. This is where I'll be joining you, where I'm joining you from in Melbourne today. I feel that when looking at the list of people that had signed up for the webinar, so many people actually will know what my background is, and so how do you summarise over 30 years in the sector in the elevator pitch? So just quickly, I actually started my career in international education while I was still at university in an English language centre. And since then, I've worked for a not-for-profit student organisation. I've worked for 2 universities, including being one of the original road warriors out there doing student recruitment, including when we had to do admissions using carbon paper to write our offer letters. Then I joined the government, and I think that that's probably where for those of you that are reading what I'm contributing now to the Koala News, that's one of the lenses that I'm trying to bring to the writing that I do, is that I have got this perspective. I was Canberra, born and bred, lived there for over 40 years, and have been, have had that public service connection. So joined the Department of Education in Australian Education International, and then during a machinery of government change, or a MOG as they call it in Canberra, I went across to Austrade and also had a stint as the ASEAN Education Commissioner based in Singapore. Then on to RMIT, where I was looking after the transnational programs, and then more recently I was running Swinburne College, which is the Swinburne Pathways College. Last year I chucked that in because I decided that it wasn't quite the right fit, and thought actually that I'd be having a bit of a year of, I called it the middle-age gap year, because I wanted to take a little bit of a break. And I set up my consultancy, Tracy Harris Solutions, but really with the idea that I would just do a little bit of work, write a little bit for Dirk, and then the ESOS Amendment Bill came out, and ever since then my middle-aged gap year hasn't been a middle-aged gap year. So really that's the lens that I'll be bringing today, and looking forward to having this chat with you. Over to Dirk.
Thank you very much, Tracy. Dirk Mulder. I also echo Claire and Tracy's acknowledgement of country, and I come to you from Durham country in Western Sydney at the moment. I echo both of your thoughts in terms of the exciting nature of what the next hour will bring, particularly some of the questions that may come from it. In terms of what I bring to the conversation, I guess I am the CEO and founder of the Koala News, and that's been going for a little bit over about a year and a half now, hopefully bringing up-to-date information on the international education sector, primarily Australian focused, to folks within the international sector here in Australia. Prior to that, I did write for Campus Morning Mail for a number of years, and my background, similar to Tracy, started with universities. I also was a road warrior to begin with, and worked my way up through the kind of chain where I became an international director at 2 universities, as well as hold a directorship within an international office at a third. I've been on the boards of Study Perth twice and Board of Study Adelaide, and really, I guess, bring to it a sense of what I like to say, the entire student journey. I've tried to be right across that the entire time that I've been in the international sector, and that continues through the lens of, I guess, commentating on it now and trying to bring up-to-date news where relevant. That probably does it for the introduction. So I'm going to kick off and just set the scene if I can. I'll probably spend 5 minutes just talking through a little bit about what's happened this week and how that's built up to this week. So obviously on Monday the 18th of November, it was kind of D-Day for what we call the ESOS bill. That was introduced back on the 16th of May into Parliament, and it had a number of sittings. But the government will probably argue that this work has been in development for a very long time, and I just want to take a slight look back. If we go back to the middle to the end of 2022, we had 4 major reports commissioned by the government. We had the Australian Universities Report, we had the Migration System for Australia's Future, we had the Rapid Review into the Exploitation of Australia's Visa System, and we had the Inquiry into Tourism and International Education. Now, they all worked somewhat in parallel, but also somewhat independently. The government, I think, would argue that it's very much in parallel, and they're drawing from each of those across a number of bills. But that leads up to, I guess, 4 pieces of work that I would argue that are intertwined into what we're talking about today. Those are the Higher Education Support Amendment, which went through in October of 23. We've got the Migration Strategy, which has come out, and we've now got 2 bills before Parliament, one of which we'll concentrate on today, but the other one's also important, and that's the Universities Accord, Student Support and Other Measures Act, and I'll come back to that in a minute. The ESOS Amendment Bill, obviously, is really the focus of today and the focus of international education, and as I mentioned, that bill was introduced on the 16th of May, and it had a number of readings. So it went over the period of a couple of months through sitting time, and on the 13th of August, it was passed with 1 amendment through the lower house. That amendment was essentially, I mean, there's more to it, but essentially it was to ensure that there was an independent review of this process, or whatever would ended up passing, 12 months, I believe, post the implementation. And that amendment was introduced by Dr. Monique Ryan, who was an independent. On the 15th of August, that passed the House, and it was sent to the Senate on the 15th. The Senate then kicked it to a committee, which is the Employment and Education Committee, which scheduled 2 sittings, and many of you would be across that, and including both Claire and Tracy appeared before those committees I think in the first 2 iterations. So much so was the discussion in those first 2 sittings that the committee called for another sitting and then another sitting after that. Now, I would say, in my view, that that's somewhat irregular. Claire and Tracy may have another opinion on that, but I would say that's somewhat irregular, and that drew out proceedings a little bit. So there was a lot of attention on this bill at the Senate committee stage. That Senate committee process wrapped up a number of weeks ago, and a report was issued by the committee to the Senate. And essentially, there were 4 documents that sat within that. The first was, I guess, the overall committee response, which was to approve or recommendation to approve the ESOS Act as it was, with a number of amendments or some slight alterations. And that predominantly was written by the Labor Party or the ALP. The Liberal Party had, I guess, a statement within that. In our discussion in this, Claire and I discussed, I think this was a minority report or something along those. It wasn't a minority report, but it could have been. And this is a really big distinction that we'll come back to as we analyse what's been going on. The Greens put in a report, and the Greens the Liberal Party view was there wasn't really too much in terms of amendments or anything solid in that, but there was a lot of rhetoric around how the LP has not done well in the migration sense, how they've dropped the ball on immigration. And we see that, I guess, consistently through to some of the rhetoric today from coming out of the Liberal Party or the coalition. The Greens put forward a part of that response, which certainly opposed the bill as it was and put forward a number of amendments. And the 4th piece of information in that process was from the independent David Pocock, who also put forward a number of amendments. So concluding that process, we all waited with bated breath for Monday, which was the 18th, where this would go to the Senate for a debate. And the lead up into this was quite significant. Tracy, Claire, and myself have all reported on this significantly. Monday came, and I think, along with a lot of other commentators and journalists around the country, and probably many of you, I got a very, very big cup of coffee and sat in front of the computer nice and early to start looking at what the Senate may say about this. The day opened with Penny Wong actually putting forward a motion around censoring a couple of senators. You would have seen this in the media cycle. We then moved on to, and I come back to, the Universities Accord Student Support and Other Measures Act, and there were a number of pieces of legislation in that session that were due to be debated, and that included the ESOS Act. However, the Universities Accord and Student Support and Other Measures Act was before it. The debate on that took so long, or took longer, or it exhausted the period for that session. So the debate on the ESOS Act was pushed to later that night, and this is where I guess some of the things that we've been hearing in the media over the last few days came to light. There were whispers earlier that morning through a Sydney Morning Herald article that was published that the coalition would not support the Act. And I think it's fair to say that 99% of the sector, including myself and the people on this panel, thought that the Liberals would support this, or the coalition would support the bill going through. So it caught a number of people on surprise. That article, I guess, started the whispers, and then we saw an announcement by Senator Henderson, by Patterson and by Tehan combined, so formally stating that the coalition would not support the bill. Shortly then after, the Greens then put out an announcement via Senator Faruqi, who announced that Labor's plan was dead in the water. So we now had 2 parties that opposed the bill, and it was probably fairly safe to say that the bill in its present form may not see the light again. Fast forward to 7/19 that night and the following session of government business, where the Accord bill was finished, and then we moved on to the ESOS bill. We had 3 speakers speak to the debate. Firstly, Senator Henderson spoke and essentially used the time to point the finger at Labor and be able to talk a little bit about how they dropped the ball on immigration, and pointed out a lot of the information that came through the committee process that negatively affected the Labor Party. We then had Senator Faruqi, who spoke very consistently, I think, to what had been spoken to in committee, who again pointed out all the faults in the legislation and again stated that the Greens would not be supporting that. Finally, we had Senator Sheldon, who was the chair of the Employment and Education Committee, speak on behalf of the Labor Party. And he got probably about halfway through his speech when 8 o'clock hit and the Deputy President called time for an adjournment. That was the end of the debate. And then we all got up the next morning thinking, wow, what's going to happen? And since then, while technically the bill is still alive, it hasn't been rescinded, it has not been presented on the order of business for the Senate to be redebated. So in a sense, that's the platform, or that's the background, that's the kind of setting in which we now move into analysis. And Claire, I'll throw it over to you.
Yes, the stats nerd's coming in now and the policy nerd. Thank you, Dirk. Great summary of where we got to. And so what I thought might be helpful is to canvass the options that are possible. These are not things I think should be done, right? I would not have started here, but this is where we are. And these are, I think I've either got 5 or 6 possible options for the government. One is to do absolutely nothing. You will have noticed that they have made a change to evidence levels, whereby if you're a private vet provider or an ELICOS provider and your risk assessments have gone backwards, that is now factored into your evidence level. For everybody else, you can only go up and improve, and that will help a bit with student visa processing. And the government might stop there, and it could do. But if it does do that, it will reinforce the problems that have emerged this year, which is the group of 8 universities, some, maybe not all of them, will continue to grow, and that's clearly a point of political contention. And while the Department of Home Affairs have also said that there are fewer visa rejections decisions being made because people are coming to grips better with MD 106, which no one in the sector talks about, crucially important, the genuine student test. If you did nothing, the group of 8 would get even more students, and there would be more students overall because people are putting in better student visa applications. So I think that's unlikely. The second thing that they could do, again, I don't know that this would work, but it's an option. They could revise the methodology and try and negotiate with the coalition. I don't think that's going to work, but I have done some further analysis of their numbers and the data flaws that I found in the methodology. I didn't go looking for them. I was just trying to make sense of who got which cap, but I found a lot of flaws. I will be double, triple checking that over the weekend, and I will publish it on the news part of my website and share it on social media on Monday. You could have fewer overall students by dealing with all the methodological problems that I found and not giving places to providers whose registration have been cancelled. And all but 4 universities would be better off than they are under the current approach. Private higher education providers would be better off. TAFEs would be the same. And only 40 private vet providers would be worse off. And the overall number of new students would be less. I know that sounds magical. How on earth has she done this? Her abacus isn't working. I'm going to triple check that, but I'm really confident of it, and I will put that out. It's not to say that's how the cap should have been calculated. It's merely to put forward that the methodology is really bad. It doesn't serve a good public policy purpose, and that is an option. You could try and fix the methodology and try and negotiate with the coalition. Other options, and I did see a question earlier about what about MD 107? It would be cool. You don't need to revoke Ministerial Direction 107. You could rewrite it. It's a direction that says which order visas should be prioritised in. You could rewrite it and say, prioritise visa applications for students wanting to study at regional universities first. Second, outer metropolitan universities. Third, who did I have third? TAFE institutes, right? These are the public policy priorities for the government. And fourth, everybody else based on evidence level rating. You could easily do that, and it would reorder things, and it would give the outer metropolitan and regional universities and TAFE institutes a leg up, which they haven't had in the current arrangements. Those who have a low evidence level rating would be there and thereabouts, and those who have a worse evidence level rating would be down the back of the queue. That's quite easy to do, right? Change of ministerial direction, doesn't require legislation, doesn't require argument and negotiation. You could reduce the number of staff in Home Affairs that are available to process student visa applications. Put them into processing the backlog in asylum seeker claims, including from, let's be honest, some non-genuine students, right? Students who are not genuine asylum seekers. That is not a good policy solution, right? Nobody wins. Students don't, their parents, their families, and providers, but you could easily do that, right? The student visa applications just mount up, and it takes longer for all of them to get processed because there's fewer staff there doing it. Julie Hare, writing in the AFR, had a discussion about using the government's powers under the Migration Act to issue a legislative instrument which would impose an overall number lower than we've had previously at the level the government wants of student visas that will be granted in 2025. And the very last one that I could think of, you might have others, you could amend the ESOS National Code. That's also a legislative instrument. And standard 2 of the code goes to student recruitment. You could write something like, or add something like, when recruiting new international students, the provider must take into account the new overseas, what is it called? NOSC, new overseas student commencements cap issued by the minister or risk breaching the ESOS Act, or words to that effect, right? That's also open to the government. It's not good public policy, but that's another option. So that's what could be done by the government to try and get on top of the problem and challenges that it finds itself facing. Colleagues, I think, Tracy, you had some thoughts.
So for me, I'm going to also try to tackle a couple of the questions that have come into the Q&A in my answer in my next piece, because I think that it's relevant. And I said this in the Koala News quite regularly throughout this whole process. We've seen the Greens talk about Labor and the coalition being in a race to the bottom. And I made a mention about how I think from what we saw from Senator Henderson and Tony Sheldon on Monday night in their statements in the Senate, that we got a glimpse of the bottom. Well, we've really seen the bottom now these last few days for the rest of this week, and it's pretty putrid and it's pretty vile. I've been keeping an eye on what's been happening in both the Hansards, in the Senate and the House of Reps, and just to give you a couple of examples of the kind of things that are happening, which tell me that, so let me tell you the things that have been said, and then I'll do a bit of a summary about what I think that this means. The first thing is that we've got Peter Dutton, this figure of $1.4 billion that the University of Sydney has earned is rusted on. In his statement on Monday or Tuesday, he used it 4 times. Senator Henderson put out a release yesterday. She also used it, but made it $1.45 billion. There is definitely any of the group of 8 that are making this kind of money. What Dutton said was that we're not going to have a situation where universities are making $1.4 billion a year, meaning those students who are here under that money-making project are taking up rental accommodation, in particular from Australians who can't get into rental accommodation. The scene has been set that this is about migration and about housing. He then also, sorry, that's me saying that. I finished, I'm saying that the scene has been set, that this is about migration and housing. And in this race to the bottom and where things are getting pretty vile, he also went on to say that, some of the places that international students are living in, there's pretty schmick accommodation. We've then had, because of the Senator Henderson having some meetings with private providers, Tian being the same. You had Tony Sheldon say in the Senate this week about the kinds, referring to the Secretary of the Liberal Party, that he funds the programs and policies for the views that he holds, and he reaches out to all the shonky, exploitative immigration and migration agents in the case of international student cap usage. And he went on to say that, of course, Senator Henderson has supported those agents, and she's not only supported the agents, but also supported those agents that fund the Liberal Party. They've been caught with their hand in the cookie jar. So this is now where we can start to see that the narrative is going to become quite personal, and where I think the sector then becomes collateral damage in all of this. Henderson, just to make one final comment about what Henderson has also gone on to say, that Labor's student cap reeks of elitism and unfairness, which will do nothing to fix Australia's migration and housing crisis. And that's why the coalition will oppose the student cap legislation. So to pick up on a couple of the questions that are in here before I go on to talk about what I think is next, do I think that there's a possibility that there will be a relisting next week and some kind of negotiation where there's actually some quite nastiness happening between the two parties. You've now got Labor accusing the Liberals of getting in bed with the Greens, which in that kind of that's an unholy alliance as far as the Greens and Liberal are concerned. So I don't see that happening. We've only got 4 days. There's a lot of legislation still to be debated. So for there to be an amendment, there's amendments to happen that would be substantive enough for either the Liberal Party or the Greens to change their mind, I don't see that happening. I also want to pick up on Michael's question about will the concept of caps remain or be abolished. Both parties this week have continued, when I talk about the major parties, Labor and Liberal, have talked about caps, that they want caps. This is an absolute election promise. This is about caps. So when I was thinking about what next for the international education sector, and with over 500 people that were signed up for this webinar from all different kinds of parts of the sector, junior up to very senior, what I wanted to do is say, I think that there's a call to action, and I'm going to talk about it in 2 parts. My first call to action is that every single one of us has a responsibility for the students that are already here, the 800,000 of them, that are reading some of this stuff that is in the media, that is putrid, it is vile. Some of the stuff that Pauline Hanson was putting out earlier this week, it is revolting. Between now and the election, we have a responsibility to care for those students that are already here, as well as the ones who want to come. But I'm really focused in my call to action on what are we doing for the students that are here? How are we wrapping our arms around them? And this is not the responsibility of the International Student Advisors Office. Oh, well, that's their, they deal directly with the students. How many of your teaching staff, how many of your academics are actually aware of what's going on in this space? Because, we're mired in it. We know all the detail, but do they know? Do they see what's happening? Are they putting a care out for the extra care for their international students in the classroom, for example, with over these next few months? What are you saying to the students that are staying here over the summer, those of you who have got classes that are still happening over that period? So for my first plea and call to action for the sector is we need to be making sure that our students know that we want them. And the big P politics that the Labor Party and the Liberal Party are playing is about domestic. It's a domestic agenda. How you explain that, I don't have an easy answer, except to make sure that we are wrapping our arms around those students. My second call to action is we've got a role now between now and the election to show both the Liberal and Labor Party what we're made of. And that could be in a couple of different ways. The first way is that we need to behave well. We just have to not behave badly. So MD 107 stays in place, but there's no caps. If you were a provider that was going to be really impacted by the caps, do you all of a sudden go, shit, I've only got a few months to try before May, if we think that the election's in May, to recruit as many students as I possibly can and make lots of money? So, and then whatever happens after that. If enough of providers do that, then we just shoot ourselves in the foot, and we reinforce what the Labor and Liberal Party, whoever gets in, want to do to us, because then they can say, well, look at your behaviour. So yes, caps didn't get through, and look at how you behaved. And then the second part is to then be standing up and saying, well, what do we want this to look like? You know, we can't just rely on the peak bodies, and I think the peak bodies have definitely got a role to play. And, you know, I'm happy to have been elected to the IAA board and looking forward to having my say and what I can do there. But I think every single provider has a responsibility to behave well. And I'm not just talking about private vet providers that, you know, get the raw end of the deal a lot of the time. I'm also talking about the big end of town. And I think that's probably enough of a rant for me. I'll come back to some other comments later on. I'm going to throw over to Dirk.
Yeah, thanks, Tracy. And some really, really good points that you make. I think, you know, ensuring that students that are here and students overseas that are looking to come here know that we're more than just a headline. And I think that, to me, really kind of decants this whole debate. I mean, we've been following this now for a couple of years, and to see the debate in Parliament, to see the questions in question time yesterday literally point the finger at each other as to who's had dinner with what group of people, to make it look like people are siding up and are corrupt, it's just a really, really disappointing end or apex to a discussion which should have a lot more. So I'd make a couple of points. First and foremost, that we have all of this has descended into a singular or unilateral discussion about migration. We saw early on the Labor Party talk about linking it to housing, and then we saw reports come out from the Property Council and the Student Accommodation Council. We saw the Group of Eight put something out that talked more about supply than actual international students taking the rental market off of others. We're about to see, and I hope Tori doesn't mind this, but I had a good chat with Tori from the Property Council yesterday. We're going to start seeing some data out around, you know, the amount of domestic students that are in rental markets in urban areas that come from regional areas. So this isn't just an international student problem. Labor then went on to talk about shonks and integrity, and when we looked at what ASQA did, and we looked at not so much TechSub, but when we looked at ASQA, the amount of notices were minuscule. It's from my point of view, there isn't a massive integrity issue. There are a number of providers that need to be cleaned out, but it is not the predominant number of within the sector. So we've had two furphies that have been underlying the premise or the why as to why we're having this migration debate. I've long said that I think we're missing the debate around the value of international students, and we can talk about that through a number of lenses. For 20 years, I've hated the lens of economic contribution of international students, because I think that it minimises their contributions in so many other ways when we just talk about dollars. When we're in this debate, though, dollars count, and I think it is really, really important that we talk about the economic contribution. When we think about that, English Australia, ABS put out some data just recently. English Australia has just recently released some data from the Demographers Workshop. $13.75 billion is what international students generate or impact locally yearly. That's not to take into account the $37 billion that's in export revenue as well. So I think this is really, really important that we bring that up. I'm going to quote someone who I have admired for a short period of time, because he's only been on the scene for a little bit of time. But George Williams, who's the new Vice Chancellor at the University of Western Sydney, wrote in The Guardian yesterday, beyond speaking at very, very well at one of the committee hearings as well. But he spoke about, I think, a three-pole kind of discussion that we now have the opportunity to have. One is about migration and what are those numbers? What do they look like? What do they mean? But there's two other discussions that we're really missing. And one is the role of international education. So what actually is that? What are we doing as international educators in Australia, and what is our purpose? And I think it's an important, feasible discussion to have. The third then is what I've been talking about, which is the student value. What I like about this, and Tracy, I pick up on your point of, you know, what are we made of over the next little bit? Again, I think George and the University of Western Sydney and whoever's behind George in the policy development of this has been super, super smart. Western Sydney can talk about very, very clearly that 24 cents in the dollar from every international student goes to a domestic student. They can talk about programs that will be cut if international students decrease. They can talk about what the impact is to their region in healthcare and in other professions. They can talk about accommodation with absolute certainty around where their students sleep at night and the impact that has on the rental market. Now, if I'm in, and I'm certainly, this is not meant to be critical of anything, but when we look forward and when we show what we are made of over the next few months before the election, if I'm a vice chancellor at another university, that's the data that I want to be pinning on. I want to be saying, what is the impact my institution, what is the impact my international students have on my institution, on my region, and what will that impact be if that is lessened? That then, if I'm in Universities Australia's view or in the IEA's pocket, if you can collate that data, you get a sense across the country. You can get a sense regionally. If you're the Group of 8 or the IRU, you get a sense of it across your network. What does that then mean? And the important part of this is to speak it in plain language. And that's where UWS or Western Sydney does really, really well. 24 cents in the dollar is something people understand. Not having nurses in hospitals is something people understand. Not to be critical of the University of Sydney, but when they talk about a research institute that might cost X millions of dollars and that might, that's funded by international students, that's not relatable to the average Australian. As much as it should be, because it might be a cancer treatment or it might be something that extends the body of knowledge in an area that is really, really important. But we're talking about top end of town stuff. We're not talking about the impacts on the local region and the impacts on the people of the local region. Mike Stevenson had a comment. I think I just answered it by that, Mike. The immediate impact of the caps. What's a future focus? I think that's what it needs to be. We need to get down to what is the impact locally, and we need to be definitive. We need to be able to be really clear about those basic impacts. And it's something I don't think that we've characterised very well up until this point.
Dirk, before you go on, I might pick up on Mike's comment and yours as well, if that's okay. Just to say, I've got this article that's been floating around in my head for some months now, just because I have been in the sector for so long. Around we're talking now about social license. There's been a lot of talk this year about the sector having social license, and the questions that are in my mind is what is social license? Have we ever had it as a sector? Is one of the questions that I would want to tackle. My personal view is we had it very briefly during COVID because people felt sorry for the students and we didn't have them delivering our Uber Eats, and we had to wait around to get our deliveries. So we had a really brief moment, but I'm not sure that other than that we've ever had social license. So this mythical thing that the politicians are talking about, we need to have it. Have we ever really had it? And the other question that's in my mind is, what would it look like if we did have it? Because I'm not sure that, because again, we're talking about this in very broad terms, that we need to have a social license, but I don't think we've actually ever defined, but what would it look like? So if the community understands the impact of international students, so what? So I don't have answers, but it's an article that's been in that those kind of concepts are in my head of something that I'd like to tackle at some point.
I couldn't agree with you more, Tracy. Sorry, Claire. I couldn't agree with you more. That term social license seems to be a term that's thrown out when it's needed, and it seems to have different implications in different settings. The example that I have used in the past and I continue to use is, while we may have lost our social license onshore because there seems to be this view from government that universities have strayed away from its main purpose, which is educating domestic students, but then in the same breath encourages institutions to take that same money and establish sites offshore, completely perplexes me. I don't understand how you can say bringing international students onshore loses your social license, but taking government funding or earned revenue and going to set up offshore somehow magically fits within social license. It's perplexing. Sorry, Claire, you were going to say something.
That's all right. I'm going to do two things. One, there is, if you haven't seen it yet, the latest from the Scanlon Foundation Research Institute, mapping social cohesion. It's been in some of the press. There's a figure in there, figure 10, which I will put on the same page where I post this video, because it is changing views on migration in Australia, mapped against the unemployment rate, economic growth, and the level of immigration. It's really stark. There is no question why this is an issue and why politicians are going to continue to dig into it. And I'm also going to suggest, with only 20 minutes to go and quite a number of questions coming in, we were going to do a bit of future projectioning what might happen. Some of those are addressed in the questions. So if you two are both comfortable, if we go to questions, if you're good, we're all good with this team? Yes, we've got nodding.
Sure.
This is very good.
Of course.
Because I think perhaps there's a couple of questions which are, will there be caps or not? We've tried to do, and I might not have been clear enough in my, what might the government do? So echoing Tracy's point and Dirk's, there is no doubt that the current government and a future coalition government want fewer international students, and they want to change where they are studying. Right? Whether they use, it seems unlikely that legislation is coming back, barring a miracle renegotiation over the weekend with the coalition, which the coalition don't want. There's political points to be scored, as Tracy and Dirk have talked to. So legislating a cap through a change to the ESOS Act seems highly unlikely, but we'll know by this time next week. That does not mean that the government will do nothing. And it sure as heck does not mean that if there is a change of government, the coalition will do nothing. So what I rattled through, and again, I won't share all of that, some of that's just my subscribers, but what I rattled through, you have to listen back to the audio or something, is some of the mechanisms government can use to try and stop you enrolling as many students as you might like to. And while they're trying to do that, keep Tracy's advice in mind. The problem is, I think there's a few more rogue private vet providers than Dirk, but nonetheless, they are not the majority, no question. The people who will do, let's go out and enrol as many as we can, are probably not tuned in and listening to this webinar, right? But nonetheless, if you don't want to be hammered later, now is the time to do your very best to not go hell for leather at the moment in terms of your student recruitment. An anonymous person has talked about...
Sorry, Claire, can I just quickly, just because it's relevant to this line of questioning, I just want to just be clear that the bill doesn't get rescinded. There isn't a mechanism for that to happen. So it stays as adjourned. It's currently, the second reading debate is adjourned. And that's where it stays, because until it, well, if there's a new parliament that gets in, then it dies. But until then, that second reading debate stays adjourned. If the parliament wants to put it, if the government wants to put it back on the agenda, have it voted on and be voted down, it can do that. But in that mechanism is still the opportunity for senators to actually put their views forward about amendments. And I just don't think they'll waste the time to do that in the 4 days that they've got left. Correct.
Because while it sits there adjourned, it's no point bringing it back in February, right? Because all the new students will have come through.
Exactly.
So it really is, while technically, you're right, technically it sits there till it's brought back or there's a, end of the parliament. It really is, next week is pretty much it in terms of a practical application to give effect to something substantive for enrolments for next year.
And there were 28 other bills and sub-bills. So I didn't add there was some bills within bills. There are 28 other bills in the Senate for that have barely touched the surface. So I just don't see that happening next week.
And as to the person saying, why not set just an overall cap? And I presume you mean try and negotiate on that and then let the market do its work. That will feed all of the things that both the Coalition and Labor, rightly or wrongly, and I studied at USyd and at UQ and had a lovely time, but it will just, the market will do its work and the group of 8 will do very nicely out of it. So I don't think that's ever going to happen. That's not how they're going to negotiate this through. I did see someone saying about agents, and I think this is really important because what a shame that there wasn't a negotiation to split the bill, right? Because there was some controls on some onshore agent behaviour in what was drafted, and people had views, and Austrade was something to be an education agent and all sorts of, well, in my view, wild and fanciful things like that. But there was an attempt to try and get control of some of the problematic behaviour that's happening onshore. That's now also been lost.
Yeah, and this is where we've seen this week the Labor Party talk about the Liberal Party aligning itself with the shonks and the crooks. And so in the way that I'm reading it is that the caps bit is what the Liberal Party is focusing on, and the Labor Party is focusing on the crooks and the shonks, not the numbers of the caps. So that's where the debate is going to be.
Yeah. We've got we've got thousands of others. Sorry, I'm too slow going through these. A few minutes on, well, private higher education providers have popped up a couple of times, and they're as in this as anybody else, right? They've done better than private vet providers and ELICOS under the changes to evidence levels. If you're a private higher education provider whose student recruitment practices have seen you drop an evidence level, the government has waived that for you. So you've benefited, right? Because you've got a good regulator, and I'm going to say a good peak body who's advocated well on your behalf, and the government can distinguish between the private sector, which it hasn't always been able to. You are in exactly the same situation when it comes to whether there will be caps. Unlikely. Next week, can't see the legislation coming back. And what does that mean for the future? It's exactly the same as for the universities. If you go hell for leather on recruitment, the whole sector is likely to suffer the consequences. If you can do, going to Dirk's point about Western Sydney University, you missed that branding while you were over in the West, Dirk. Western Sydney University and others. I think I saw La Trobe was out talking about their healthcare and needing nurses in regional areas. If you can be making the case for what you do and why international students are important, that you educate and how they contribute, and keep going, enroll students, but don't go over the top. Everybody is in the same situation, except for, the poor old ELICOS sector, who were excluded from all of this and suddenly got thrown in at the last minute when, not around caps, but around the changes to the evidence level assessment. Somehow or other, ELICOS now is seen as problematic as the private vet sector. And again, caveats, lots of good private vet providers, lots of good ELICOS providers, but somehow or other, in the Department of Home Affairs and ministerial thinking, that's now the part of the sector that needs to be delayed. And I wonder if this might not be because in the coalition's arguments against the legislation, that it has too many exemptions, too many additional students come in over the caps. They specifically went to, Mike, if you've got a question, we're not doing hands up or we'll be overwhelmed. You just type it in, or we had someone stuck a hand up. Sorry about that. But otherwise just can be too much while we rattle through the last 10 minutes. So the coalition put the ELICOS sector in as an example of a sector that should be capped. That them having an exemption meant overall new student numbers were too high. And I wonder if that is why, because there's a high turnover of lots of students coming through ELICOS, whether that is why they've been told that if their evidence level goes backwards, it will show up, whereas higher education, public and private, TAFEs have been safeguarded and quarantined. I was surprised to see the ELICOS sector treated in that way.
I think you might be right on that one, Claire, because in Henderson's statement in the Senate on Monday night, the issue that she put forward, one of the issues she put forward was the cap. The NOSC is the National Planning Level is 270,000, but actually, when you add all of the exemptions, it's more than 400,000. And Ellicott was the first one that she talked about, and that got Tony Sheldon quite irate. He got up and started to talk about, but they only come for 3 months and they're not included as part of the NOM, which isn't quite right either. But there was also a line of questioning around this in Senate estimates too. So somehow they've got it in their mind that the Ellicott sector is also adding to this. And I'm going to take one question to answer because I've got an answer for it, which is Pam Jonas. Pam's asked a question about, have we ever questioned why international students are included in the immigration numbers? Pam, there was a really good piece that was put out by the ABS not that long ago, a couple of months ago, I think maybe in August. I wrote a piece on it, which will have the link to it, which does explain why international students are counted and who's counted in the net overseas migration figure and who's not. We will try to maybe put it in the koala when we do the summary. We might put a link to that story, but go back and have a read of that, because there is actually a global reason. Yeah. So it's not about Australia deciding and making the decision to include it or exclude it. There's a global
12 months in 15 months in the country or something like that, isn't it?
16 months. They have to be here for 12 out of 16.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, to count in the NOM.
Yeah.
Edward said private providers will recruit as fast as they can. Selfishly, they need to survive. There's no Trumpian call to send them home. Edward, you and I read different media. There is this is where the Sydney Morning Herald articles this week are going to cause significant problems for the coalition. The coalition view is too many students coming in and too many hanging around and going on to multiple visas to stay, and then attending a fundraiser at an education agent who apparently advertises how good they are if your student visa is running out and to help you stay. So I do think this is a big risk for private providers. And yes, I know them quite well. I used to know them. I don't so much anymore. But I do know them quite well. I'm lucky I only deal with the lovely ones. But yes, the rogues are still out there, and others who are desperate and focused on their own. I would still say go easy, go gentle, or otherwise it's going to be one hell of a mess. We have got 5 minutes left. Place your bets. Will aversion, I think, Mike, we've dealt with that. Past the sitting, we don't really think it will, but we're not betting people. Is that a reasonable summary, team? Anything? I mean, what we learned this week is anything could happen. But
well, that's what I was going to say. All three of us would have put a bet on that the bill was passing this week. So I'm not putting a bet on for what might happen next week. I say my opinion is it's not going to be debated because there's too much other government agenda, and just the narrative of both parties this week tells me that, yeah, this is getting nasty rather than trying to find solutions.
Yep.
Yeah.
Agree 100%.
Dirk, what about a quick final thoughts as we kind of conclude? Any final questions you want to wrap up or rattle through?
Quick final thought. Yeah, look, I think we're in for a rough road between now and the election. I think the debate that we've seen the last couple of days is only going to intensify. Unfortunately, I think our political people, think about very carefully about who you vote for at the next election, and the integrity of those individuals. Because this is probably I can honestly say this is probably the first time that I've followed a bill from literally its drafting all the way through, and very, very closely. And I have to say I've been underwhelmed at almost every step with regards to this bill. And again, no more so than in the last couple of days. I mean, the rhetoric and the people seem more interested in tagging each other for something silly than actually doing what's right and having discussions that are really good. I'll leave you with one thought. David Pocock, in the debate for the Universities Accord bill, said we all need to start thinking about national priorities as opposed to what we're doing here right now. The example that he gave was that we take more money from students in HECS than what we do get for our gas infrastructure tax. And I think he made a really good point about priorities. And I don't think that anyone in the House at the moment is thinking about what our national priorities are, rather than just trying to sling mud on the other side and hope that it sticks and win the next election.
I'll go, and then maybe Tracy, if you wanted to wrap up. I could not agree with you more, Dirk. And as someone who grew up in New Zealand, the more fine, clever thinking, dispassionate rugby players, male or female, that we could have in our parliament,
Claire, I can't believe you're wearing all black either.
The happier that I would be. There are a couple of questions, and I just want to deal with, they fall into a couple of categories. One is a few people asking what's our sense of, will they split the bill, right? Do those other changes and leave the caps behind? Before the finger pointing happened, maybe. Where the temperature and the rhetoric is now, which Dirk and Tracy in particular have discussed, seems unlikely, right? The coalition approach appears to be, look at what a disaster it is. You can't legislate it. Vote us in. We will fix it. I could be wrong. We'll see. The second one is, and again, I've worked in public and private providers. There are private providers saying, but we really care about education and we're focused on the quality experience, and the government priorities TAFE and public university. Yes, right? You do care about the student experience. Most private providers have excellent Quilt survey ratings. And you have won some concessions from the government as a consequence. But this is a Labor government that was elected to put TAFE at the centre of the vet sector and to fix the public universities' funding. It has put TAFE at the centre of the vet sector. It's a bit stalled on getting all the things lined up, but that's its policy for the public universities. That's its policy objective, and that's what it's intending to do. Tracy, I think the final word is yours.
Fine. So I'm sorry we didn't get to everybody's questions. We did get to quite a lot, but not everybody. If there is a burning question in there that you want to follow up with us on, then please get in touch with any one of us. We'd be happy to do that. So it comes to me to do a final wrap up. I want to thank everybody for coming along. Thank Claire and Dirk as well for being part of this discussion. I thought that when Claire asked if we would do that this week, what could we contribute? I think that none of us know exactly what's going to happen, but we thought we would share our thoughts, and I think that that was the goal for today. We do a lot of this stuff for nothing. And so this is there's no such thing as a free lunch. This is my my plug at the end. A lot of the stuff that Claire, Dirk and I have done this year has been for the sector, because we're passionate about it. We've been in it for so long, and we've done it for you. But don't forget that we all have bills to pay, and we have meals that we need to buy for ourselves. So I'm going to do my last plug. All three of us have got our own consultancies. I want to talk about Claire first. If you're not already a subscriber to Claire's weekly deep dives on the sector, she's offering a 1 month free trial for you. So if you haven't already done that, go on to the contact form on her website, which is clairefield.com.au, or email Claire, which is claire@clairefield.com.au. For Dirk, hopefully most of you are already subscribers of the Koala News. If you're not a subscriber, then what are you doing? You're behind the 8 ball on that one. So please subscribe. Get onto the koalanews.com and you can subscribe from there, and you see the stuff that we post on social media, but you'll also see that you'll get a weekly newsletter. But there's also opportunities to sponsor with Koala. There's job ad boards that you can sponsor. So, put your money where your mouth is if you have any. And for me, I would also put a final plug in that I've also, I've got my shingle hung out there. I'm not looking for lots and lots of work, but there are some things that I can do around particularly governance that I've got some expertise in. So reach out to me as well if you think that there is something that any one of us can help you with. And you can get in touch with me either via LinkedIn or Tracy at tracyharrissolutions.com. So we're right on 2 o'clock. I think that's time. Thanks everybody for joining us. It's been great to be able to be with you.
Thank you all.
Thanks.